July 17th, 1944. 3 miles southeast of Caen, Normandy, France. Oberleutnant Friedrich Müller crouched behind the sloped frontal armor of his Panther tank, turret number 4, 2, 1, watching the hedgerow country through the commander's cupola. His crew had been told the Americans were inexperienced tankers, hastily trained mechanics operating inferior machines. The Panther beneath him was a masterpiece of German engineering. 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, a 7.5 centimeter KBUK 42 gun capable of penetrating 139 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. This was the weapon that would stop the Allied advance. Through the vision blocks, Müller watched an American column moving up a narrow farm road. Sherman tanks, 5 of them, standard 75mm gun variants, just as intelligence had described. He'd studied the briefings. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American tanks relied on numbers, not quality. Their armor was thin. Their guns were adequate against Panzer Fours, but useless against a Panther's frontal plate. Müller's gunner, Gefreiter Hans Kraus, tracked the lead Sherman through his Termsiel Fernrohr 12 binocular sight. Range: 900 meters. Well within killing distance. The Panther's long gun could reach out over 2,000 meters if needed. These Americans had no idea what they were about to face. Load armor piercing, Müller ordered. The loader, Oberleutnant Otto Schmidt, pulled a 7.5 centimeter Panzergranate 3942 round from the ready rack. The shell was long, heavy, powerful. He wrestled it into the breech with practiced efficiency. The semi-automatic ejection system would eject the spent casing automatically after firing, dropping it into a catch bin. 6 seconds. That's how long it took to reload from the ready racks. Perhaps 8 seconds if they had to pull from the hull-mounted ammunition stores. About 6 rounds per minute in sustained fire, adequate for a gun of this power. Loaded, Schmidt confirmed. Müller settled his hand on the turret traverse control. The Panther's turret could rotate, but not quickly, not like the American tanks with their powered traverse systems. Still, positioned correctly, speed wasn't necessary. What mattered was the first shot, and the Panther's gun never missed at this range. The lead Sherman continued forward, oblivious. Its commander's head was visible in the cupola, scanning the bocage with binoculars. The American had no idea death was watching from 800 meters away. Target, lead tank, fire when ready. Kraus made final adjustments. The sight picture was perfect. Center mass on the Sherman's hull. At this angle, the 75mm Panzergranate would punch through the frontal armor like paper. The Sherman's maximum frontal thickness was about 76 millimeters at a 56-degree slope. Against the Panther's gun, it might as well have been cardboard. What happened in the next 90 seconds would demolish every assumption Müller and his crew held about American armor. Kraus fired. The Panther rocked back against its recoil system. The muzzle brake directed gases to the sides. Smoke obscured the vision blocks momentarily. Through the clearing haze, Müller saw the Sherman take the hit on its frontal slope. The round glanced off, ricocheting skyward in a shower of sparks. A non-penetrating hit, possible, but unlikely at this range and angle. Before Schmidt could reload, something impossible happened. The 5 Sherman tanks opened fire, not one after another. Simultaneously, a wall of 75mm shells screamed through the air. Some hit the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheted. Others slammed into the turret mantlet, sending shockwaves through the crew compartment. The Americans weren't pausing to reload. They were shooting continuously. Müller's training screamed at him to count. 1 round per tank, then a pause for reloading. 6 seconds minimum, 8 seconds more likely. Time to acquire, time to load, time to fire again. That was the rhythm of tank combat. Fire, reload, fire. But the Shermans weren't following that rhythm. The first Sherman fired, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth, then the first fired again, and again, and again. There was no pause, no gap in the incoming fire. Just a continuous roar of 75mm guns hurling shells at the Panther's position. In the time it took Schmidt to reload 1 round 6 seconds, the American tanks had fired 20 shots. "Return fire!" Müller shouted. Krauss acquired the lead. Sherman again fired. The Panzer Granate 59-42 round struck the Sherman's frontal slope and this time penetrated, punching through into the crew compartment. The Sherman lurched to a stop, smoke beginning to pour from the hatches. 1 down, 4 remaining. Schmidt reloaded. 6 seconds. During those 6 seconds, the 4 remaining Shermans fired 16 more rounds. Müller could hear them impacting. Bang, 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 bang. A drum roll of impacts against the Panther's armour. Most ricocheted. Some struck the turret ring. Others hit the gun mantlet, the vulnerable shot trap at its lower edge where a lucky hit could ricochet downward into the thin upper hull armour. Krauss fired again. Another Sherman hit, this time in the side as it manoeuvred. The tank slewed to a stop, its track blown off. Crew members bailed out, running for cover. 2 down, 3 remaining. The mathematics were undeniable. In the time required to fire 2 rounds from the Panther, approximately 12 seconds, the American tanks had fired over 40 rounds, not all aimed carefully, not all hits, but the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. Müller couldn't raise his head to observe properly. Every time he tried to look through the cupola periscopes, incoming rounds would strike near the vision blocks, forcing him back down. It wasn't how tank combat was supposed to work. Schmidt was pulling rounds from the hull racks now, the turret stores depleted. 8 seconds per round at this position. Krauss was still firing, still hitting, but for every round the Panther put out, the Americans were firing dozens. The German advantage in gun power and armour protection was being negated by a simple, brutal fact. The Shermans could shoot 3 to 4 times faster. Müller hadn't been told about this. Intelligence briefings had mentioned the Sherman's 75mm gun. They'd noted its inferior penetration. They'd documented its thinner armour. But nowhere in any briefing had anyone mentioned that American tank crews could maintain a rate of fire that made a single Sherman equivalent to 3 Panther tanks in sheer volume of outgoing rounds. The third Sherman manoeuvred right, using the hedgerow for cover. Its turret traversed with disturbing speed. Müller had read that American tanks had powered turret traverse. The Panther could do a full 360-degree rotation in about 60 seconds if the hydraulics were working properly. The Sherman could do it in 15 seconds. The American gunner fired. The round struck the Panther's right side armour, angled but not enough. It penetrated. Schmidt screamed. The interior of the fighting compartment lit up with a ball of fire as fragments ricocheted through the crew space. The loader collapsed, blood spreading across the turret floor. "Bail out," Müller ordered. The driver and radio operator scrambled through their hatches. Krauss pushed through the turret hatch, dragging the wounded loader. Müller followed, rolling off the rear engine deck as another American round struck the turret, this time penetrating the thinner side armour. From a ditch 50 meters away, Müller watched the 3 remaining Sherman tanks continue their advance. They'd lost 2 vehicles. The Panther had achieved 2 kills. In a tactical sense, that was respectable. German crews were trained to expect favourable kill ratios, but Müller understood something that statistics and after-action reports would struggle to capture. The Americans hadn't won through superior design. They'd won through superior volume of fire. The Sherman tank, individually inferior to the Panther in nearly every technical specification, had overwhelmed his position through sheer, sustained firepower. It wasn't about the quality of the gun, it was about how many times that gun could fire while the enemy was reloading. As Müller and his surviving crew members made their way back to German lines, he tried to process what he'd witnessed. Every round the Panther fired was carefully aimed, carefully placed, fired by a trained crew following doctrine developed over years of combat experience. The Americans had fired perhaps 80 rounds in the same engagement. Maybe 20 had been hits. Maybe 10 had actually damaged anything. But those 10 hits, delivered in continuous succession without pause, without giving the Panther crew time to respond effectively, had been enough. This was the Sherman's secret. Not superior armor, not a more powerful gun, just the ability to fire, reload, and fire again faster than any German tank crew could match. The genesis of this advantage lay not in superior German engineering failing to anticipate American capability. It lay in fundamental design philosophy that dated back to the Sherman's development in 1941 and early 1942. While German tank designers focused on gunpowder and armor protection, American engineers had prioritized a different metric entirely: reliability and rate of fire. The Sherman M4 first entered production in February 1942. By July 1942, the first production models were rolling off assembly lines at 11 different plants across the United States. The design wasn't revolutionary, it was evolutionary, building on lessons learned from the M3 Lee medium tank. But it incorporated several features that would prove decisive in combat, features that German intelligence either overlooked or fundamentally misunderstood. The primary armament was the M3 75mm gun, a medium-velocity weapon derived from the French 75mm artillery piece. On paper, it was unimpressive. Muzzle velocity of about 2,030 feet per second. Penetration of roughly 88mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 100 meters when firing M61 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap rounds. Against a Panther's frontal armor 80mm at 55 degrees, giving an effective thickness of 140mm, the Sherman's 75mm gun was essentially useless. But the gun had one critical advantage. It could fire 20 rounds per minute from the ready ammunition racks. The secret lay in the turret layout and crew ergonomics. The loader stood on the right side of the turret with ready ammunition stored in racks directly beside him. The 75mm rounds were relatively light, about 14.7 pounds for a complete round. The loader could grab a round, pivot, ram it into the breech, and have the gun ready to fire in approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds. German Panther loaders, working with longer, heavier 7.5cm rounds and a more cramped turret layout, required 6 seconds minimum for the same operation. Some British motion studies conducted after the war with captured Panthers measured loading times between 5.5 and 7.1 seconds, depending on gun elevation and which ammunition rack was being accessed. That 3-second difference might not seem significant. In a single engagement, perhaps it wasn't. But in sustained combat, it was transformative. A Sherman tank, with a trained loader, could fire 20 rounds per minute. Not in practice, perhaps. Battlefield conditions, target, acquisition, and the chaos of combat reduced theoretical rates of fire. But even at half that rate, 10 rounds per minute, the Sherman was still outpacing the Panther's maximum rate of 6 to 8 rounds per minute. The Panther's gun was superior in every measurable way except one: how quickly it could put rounds downrange, and in the brutal mathematics of tank combat, that single factor often outweighed every other advantage. American tankers trained extensively on this capability. Gunnery drills emphasized speed. Loading drills focused on economy of motion. The Sherman's turret was designed around the human factors of crew operation. The loader had space to move. The gunner had a simple, effective telescopic sight. The commander had excellent visibility through periscopes in the split hatch or, on later models, an all-around vision cupola with multiple periscopes. Everything about the Sherman's design prioritized getting rounds out of the gun quickly and accurately. The tank also incorporated another feature that German designers had attempted but never successfully implemented: a gyroscopic gun stabilizer. The Westinghouse stabilizer controlled the main gun's elevation while the tank was moving. It used a gyroscope and hydraulic power drawn from the turret drive system to keep the gun steady in the vertical plane. The system was often misunderstood, even by American crews. It didn't allow accurate firing on the move. No World War II tank could reliably hit targets while driving over rough terrain, but it did something equally valuable. When a Sherman came to a halt to fire, the stabilizer kept the gun approximately on target. If the tank rocked on its suspension, the gun stayed more or less aimed where the gunner had placed it. This gave Sherman crews a critical advantage. They could get off the first shot faster than their opponents. German tanks, including the Panther, had no such system. When a Panther came to a halt, the gunner had to reacquire his target through the sights, compensate for any movement of the tank on its suspension, and then fire. This took time. Seconds, perhaps, but in tank combat, seconds mattered. The stabilizer was complicated. Early production Shermans had a system that was difficult to set up properly. Many crews, lacking training or understanding of how to use it effectively, simply turned it off. But the US Army conducted tests and found that when the stabilizer was properly set up and used by a trained crew, it provided a significant advantage in getting off a fast first shot when the tank stopped to engage. Tests showed the stabilizer could maintain gun elevation within 1/8 of a degree while crossing moderately rough terrain at 15 miles per hour. This translated to a hit probability of 70% on enemy tanks at ranges between 300 and 1,200 yards when the tank came to a stop. By mid-1943, the Army was emphasizing stabilizer training. Later production Shermans had simplified, improved stabilizers that were easier to maintain and use. Crews who bothered to learn the system reported it helped considerably. The Panther, for all its superior gun and armor, had no equivalent capability. German tank designers had attempted to develop stabilization systems, but never successfully fielded one during the war. The technical challenge of creating a reliable gyroscopic stabilizer was beyond German industrial capacity. By 1943 and 1944, when resources were stretched thin across multiple weapons programs, this combination rapid rate of fire and gyroscopic stabilization gave the Sherman a tactical advantage that wasn't immediately obvious from technical specifications. In the opening seconds of an engagement, a Sherman could often get off the first shot, and in the sustained firefight that followed, it could maintain a volume of fire that German tanks simply couldn't match. German tank doctrine emphasized careful, aimed fire from prepared positions. Panther crews were trained to maximize the advantages of their superior gun and armor by engaging at long range where American tanks couldn't effectively respond. Fire once, destroy the target, move to the next target. This worked brilliantly when German tanks could dictate the terms of engagement. But in the close, chaotic combat of the Normandy bocage, where engagement ranges often dropped to 300 meters or less, the Panther's advantages diminished while the Sherman's strengths multiplied. At ranges under 500 meters, even the Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate Panther side armor. The Panther's flanks had only 40 to 50 millimeters of armor at varying angles. A well-placed 75mm armor-piercing round could punch through, especially if it hit at 90 degrees to the armor plate. And with 4 or 5 Shermans maneuvering while firing continuously, the odds of getting those side shots increased dramatically. American doctrine reflected this reality. Tank platoons operated in coordinated teams. One tank would lay down suppressive fire, not necessarily accurate, just continuous, forcing German crews to button up and limiting their visibility. Other tanks would maneuver for flank shots. The entire platoon worked together, using their advantages in numbers, rate of fire, and coordination to overwhelm technically superior German tanks. It was the antithesis of German doctrine. Where German tankers were trained to fight as individual craftsmen, American tankers fought as a coordinated unit. Where German success depended on the skill of individual crew members making perfect shots with powerful guns, American success depended on teamwork and sustained fire. By June 1944, when American forces landed in Normandy, virtually every American tank was a Sherman. Production had reached staggering levels. 11 plants across the United States were churning out tanks at a combined rate that would total nearly 50,000 Shermans by war's end. 49,324 Shermans produced between 1942 and 1946. Against this industrial tsunami, Germany fielded approximately 1,850 Tiger tanks and 4,800 Panther tanks during the entire war. Impressive individually, insufficient strategically, but the Sherman's numerical advantage wasn't just about factory production. It was about getting those tanks into combat and keeping them there. American logistics were superb. Damaged tanks were recovered quickly. Repair facilities operated efficiently. Spare parts were abundant. A Sherman knocked out in combat could often be repaired and returned to action within days. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German Panthers, mechanically complex and increasingly starved of spare parts as Allied bombing devastated German industry, were often abandoned for minor mechanical failures. The Panther's final drive was notoriously unreliable. Many Panthers broke down before ever reaching combat. Those that did reach the front often couldn't be repaired when damaged because replacement parts simply didn't exist. The result was that even when German tanks achieved favorable kill ratios in individual engagements, the strategic situation remained hopeless. For every Panther that destroyed 2 or 3 Shermans, 10 more Shermans arrived to replace the losses. And those Shermans, firing 3 times faster than their German counterparts, could overwhelm German positions through sheer volume of fire. This was the reality that greeted German tank crews in Normandy in June and July 1944. They'd been told American tanks were inferior. They'd been shown intelligence briefs documenting the Sherman's weaker gun and thinner armor. They'd been assured that German superiority in design and training would carry the day. But intelligence briefings don't capture the sound of 20 75mm shells impacting around your tank in 30 seconds. They don't convey the psychological impact of continuous incoming fire that never seems to stop, never gives you time to breathe, never lets you raise your head to observe or plan your next move. German tankers learned quickly that doctrine and paper specifications meant little when you were taking 10 hits for every round you fired back. The reality of Sherman versus Panther combat emerged clearly during the weeks following D-Day. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, only 2 Panther-equipped panzer regiments defended the Western Front, with a total of 156 Panthers between them. By late July, 7 additional Panther regiments had arrived in France, reaching a maximum strength of 432 Panthers in a status report dated July 30, 1944. 38% of German tanks in Normandy were Panthers. Their frontal armor could not be penetrated by the 75mm guns of the standard M4 Sherman. This should have been a decisive advantage. In open terrain at long range, it was. But Normandy wasn't open terrain. The bocage country of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and small fields forced combat into close quarters, where the Panthers' range advantage disappeared. At the Battle of Caen, British and Canadian forces with their Sherman tanks engaged Panthers repeatedly. The terrain around Caen included areas of heavy bocage mixed with open fields. In the open areas, Panthers dominated. They could engage Shermans at ranges over 1,000 meters, picking them off methodarily. British tank crews reported that the Panthers' combination of superior armor and firepower allowed it to engage at distances where Shermans couldn't respond. But in the bocage, everything changed. Engagement ranges dropped to 300 meters or less. Visibility was limited. Ambush positions favored whoever moved second. And the Sherman's rate of fire became the decisive factor. On June 8, 1944, near the village of Roré, British Sherman tanks from the 24th Lancers encountered Panthers from the 1st SS Panzer Division. The fighting was brutal and close. German after-action reports noted with frustration that British Shermans refused to engage in the open, where German guns could dominate. Instead, they used the terrain, working in coordinated groups to suppress German positions with continuous fire, while other tanks maneuvered for flank shots. One Panther commander reported, "We achieved first shot kills on 2 enemy tanks, but the remaining tanks did not retreat. They fired continuously at our position. We could not raise our heads to observe. Our gunner could not maintain sight picture due to the impacts. When we attempted to relocate, enemy fire intensified. Our tank was struck multiple times on the turret and side armor. We were forced to abandon." This pattern repeated across Normandy. Panthers achieved impressive individual kill counts, but they couldn't sustain their positions under the volume of fire that concentrated Sherman formations could deliver. Even non-penetrating hits had effects. They forced crews to button up, limiting visibility. They damaged vision blocks and periscopes. They wore on crew morale, and occasionally, through sheer volume, they found weak spots. The Panther's turret mantlet had a design flaw. The curved gun shield created a shot trap at its lower edge. Rounds striking this area could ricochet downward into the thin upper hull armor where the driver and radio operator sat. Several Panthers were knocked out when Sherman fire, by luck or design, struck this vulnerable point. American forces, arriving in greater numbers through July, brought their own lessons. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra began the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. American armored divisions, equipped almost entirely with Shermans, smashed through German defensive lines. The Shermans didn't win through technical superiority. They won through numbers, coordination, and sustained fire. Lieutenant Colonel William Lovelady, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Armored Division, encountered Panthers repeatedly during the advance. One engagement became famous among his unit. A Sherman from his battalion rounded a corner in a French village and confronted a Panther at point-blank range. The Sherman got off 3 shots at the Panther's frontal armor. All 3 bounced off. The Panther returned fire, destroying the Sherman. But 4 more Shermans from the same platoon arrived within seconds. They poured fire onto the Panther from multiple angles. 20 rounds in perhaps 30 seconds. The Panther's crew, overwhelmed and unable to respond effectively to multiple targets firing simultaneously, bailed out. The tank was captured intact. This became the template for American tactics. Don't fight fair. Don't engage Panthers frontally at long range where their advantages dominate. Close the distance, use terrain, coordinate fire from multiple tanks. Force the Panther crew to deal with threats from multiple directions while taking continuous incoming fire that, even if it doesn't penetrate, degrades their ability to fight effectively. By August 1944, German commanders were reporting that American tank tactics had evolved to counter the Panther's advantages. A report from the 94th Infantry Division, captured after Rome fell, noted that encounters with American infantry typically resulted in Germans being pinned down by rifle fire. The same principle applied to tanks. Concentrated Sherman fire pinned Panthers in position, even when the fire wasn't penetrating, allowing other American forces to maneuver. The mathematics of rate of fire created cascading effects. In a one-on-one engagement at long range, the Panther was superior. But tank combat rarely occurred one-on-one. American platoons operated 5 tanks together. 5 Shermans firing 20 rounds per minute collectively meant 100 rounds per minute. Against a single Panther firing 6 rounds per minute, the volume ratio was approximately 17-1. Not all those rounds were aimed carefully. Not all were hits. But the sheer weight of fire achieved suppression, keeping enemy crews buttoned up, forcing them to cover, degrading their ability to observe and aim accurately. And in that suppressed state, Panthers became vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. German tankers had been trained that their superior equipment would carry them through. The briefings said so. The specifications said so. But specifications don't scream past your head at 20 rounds per minute. Specifications don't force you to crouch below the turret rim while impacts ring against your armor like hammers on an anvil. The Panther's 7.5 cm KOK-42 gun could penetrate 139 mm of armor at 1,000 meters. This was more than enough to destroy any Allied tank at combat ranges, but that penetrating power was useless if the gunner couldn't maintain sight picture long enough to fire accurately. And under continuous incoming fire from multiple Shermans, German gunners struggled to do exactly that. American crews learned to exploit this. Training emphasized teamwork. One tank would engage frontally, even knowing its rounds would bounce off. That tank's job was simply to keep the Panther crew occupied, keep them focused forward, force them to deal with incoming fire. While the Panther crew focused on that threat, 2 or 3 more Shermans would work around the flanks. Panther side armor ranged from 40 mm on the turret to 50 mm on the hull, angled at various degrees. At close range, the Sherman's 75 mm gun could penetrate this armor reliably. Once a Panther was engaged from multiple directions, its advantages in frontal armor became irrelevant. The British added their own innovation. Unable to get enough American 76 mm Shermans, they modified standard 75mm Shermans to mount the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun. This created the Sherman Firefly. The 17-pounder could penetrate Panther frontal armor at reasonable combat ranges. British tank platoons typically operated 4 standard Shermans and 1 Firefly. The 4 standard tanks would engage with their 75mm guns, overwhelming the target with fire. The Firefly would wait for a clear shot and deliver the killing blow. This combination proved devastatingly effective. German tankers quickly learned to identify Fireflies by their distinctive long barrel and prioritize them as targets. But in the chaos of combat, with 4 other Shermans firing continuously, picking out the Firefly before it got its shot was difficult. The Battle of Aracourt in September 1944 demonstrated these dynamics at scale. The German 5th Panzer Army attacked American positions with newly formed Panzer brigades equipped with Panthers. On paper, it should have been a German victory. Fresh Panthers in open terrain against Third Army Sherman units. But the Germans attacked poorly. Their brigade organization was new and untested. Their crews lacked cohesion. They advanced in column formation on roads, making themselves vulnerable to American ambush. And when they engaged, they discovered that American tank crews had learned their lessons well. The 3rd and 4th U.S. Armored Divisions engaged the German Panthers and achieved a kill ratio of approximately 3.6 Panthers destroyed for every Sherman lost. This wasn't because the Sherman was a better tank, it was because American crews fought smarter. They used terrain, they coordinated fire. They exploited the Sherman's advantages in rate of fire and numbers, while avoiding situations where Panther advantages in armor and gun power dominated. Post-war analysis of the Aracourt battle revealed the pattern clearly. German Panthers advancing in column were ambushed by American tanks in prepared positions. The Americans would open fire simultaneously, multiple Shermans engaging each Panther. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Even when German tanks survived the initial ambush and attempted to return fire, they found themselves taking continuous hits from multiple directions. German crews reported that the psychological impact of this sustained fire was severe. Knowing your armor was superior provided cold comfort when impacts were ringing against your tank every few seconds. Knowing your gun was more powerful didn't matter when you couldn't see clearly enough through damaged periscopes to acquire targets. The confidence that came from technical superiority eroded quickly under the reality of being outnumbered and outshot. The Sherman's mechanical reliability also played a crucial role. American tankers knew their machines would start every morning. The Ford GAA Vate engine in later model Shermans was robust and dependable. The suspension, while not sophisticated, was reliable. When a Sherman broke down, repair was straightforward. Parts were abundant. Mechanics knew the tanks intimately because the design didn't change dramatically between variants. Panthers, by contrast, were mechanically temperamental. The Maybach HL-230 engine was powerful, but complex. The transmission was sophisticated but fragile. The final drives were notoriously unreliable, often failing after 1,500 kilometers or less. Panthers broke down regularly. And by late 1944, German spare parts were increasingly scarce due to Allied bombing of German industry. A Panther that broke down during an advance often had to be abandoned. A Sherman that broke down was recovered, repaired, and returned to action. This meant that even when Germans achieved favorable exchange ratios in combat, the overall tank balance shifted steadily in favor of the Allies. German losses were permanent, American losses were temporary. By the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, these patterns were well established. German forces launched their desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes with whatever armor they could scrape together. Panthers participated, fighting alongside Panzer Fours, Tigers, and even older designs. The Germans achieved surprise and initial success. But as American forces recovered and counterattacked, the familiar dynamics reasserted themselves. German tanks, even when technically superior, couldn't overcome the combination of American numbers, firepower, and coordination. Panthers knocked out individual Shermans regularly. But for every Sherman destroyed, 3 more appeared, and those Shermans, firing continuously from multiple positions, overwhelmed German crews through sheer sustained fire. One incident during the Bulge captured the nature of this fighting. An American tank company encountered a Panther in a Belgian village on December 23, 1944. The Panther was positioned at an intersection, its gun covering the main road. The first American Sherman to approach was destroyed instantly. The second Sherman, attempting to flank through a side street, was also knocked out. The American company commander didn't withdraw. He brought up 4 more Shermans, 2 engaged from the front, firing continuously even though their rounds bounced off the Panther's armor. The other 2 worked through back alleys to get side shots. Under continuous fire from the frontal tanks, the Panther crew struggled to observe and respond. When the flanking Shermans arrived and fired into the Panther's side armor, the German tank was destroyed. 2 American Shermans lost, 1 German Panther destroyed. In tank versus tank terms, a German victory. But strategically, the Americans had 6 more Shermans available. The Germans had no replacement Panthers. The mathematics were unsustainable for Germany. The American emphasis on volume of fire extended beyond just the main gun. Sherman tanks typically carried 3 machine guns, a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun beside the main gun, a hull-mounted 7.62mm machine gun operated by the bow gunner, and a 50 caliber M2 heavy machine gun mounted on the turret roof. The 50 caliber was particularly valued. It could engage light armor and soft targets effectively. In infantry support roles, Sherman crews used their machine guns extensively, coordinating fire with the main gun to create a sustained base of fire. German Panthers had 2 MG-34 machine guns, 1 coaxial and 1 hull-mounted, effective weapons. But the Germans typically had less ammunition for them than American crews carried for their multiple machine guns. American tanks were designed around abundance of ammunition, abundance of spare parts, abundance of fuel. German tanks were designed around scarcity, trying to maximize efficiency from limited resources. This philosophical difference manifested in crew training as well. American tank crews trained on standardized equipment. Their Shermans might come from different factories, but the controls were identical. The procedures were identical. A driver trained on a Ford-built M4A3 could step into a Chrysler-built M4A3 and operate it immediately. This standardization meant replacement crews could integrate quickly. It meant veterans could share knowledge effectively. It meant the collective expertise of the American armored force increased continuously. German tank crews faced more variety. Panthers from different production batches had different components. Early OSF-D models had different turrets than later OSF-A models. OSF-G models had numerous changes. This variation complicated training and maintenance. It meant hard-won expertise. With one variant might not transfer perfectly to another. It meant spare parts inventories had to account for multiple configurations. The Sherman's turret traverse speed gave American crews another advantage. Powered by electric or hydraulic drive depending on the model, the Sherman could rotate its turret 360 degrees in approximately 15 seconds. The Panther's turret traverse was slower, taking roughly 60 seconds for a complete rotation under ideal conditions. In close combat, this made a significant difference. A Sherman could acquire, engage, and then immediately shift to a new target. A Panther had to traverse more deliberately. American tank commanders trained extensively on target prioritization. Engage the closest threat first. Suppress it with fire, even if you can't penetrate. Force the enemy to button up. Then shift fire to the next target. Keep moving. Keep shooting. Never give the enemy time to breathe. This aggressive, continuous fire doctrine worked perfectly with the Sherman's capabilities. German doctrine emphasized careful, deliberate engagement. Acquire target, range, fire, assess, fire again if necessary, move to next target. This methodical approach worked brilliantly when German tanks could dictate engagement terms. But in close, chaotic combat where multiple enemies engaged simultaneously from different directions, methodical discipline became a liability. The Sherman forced German tankers to fight on American terms. In the hedgerows of Normandy, in the villages of France and Belgium, in the forests of the Ardennes, engagement ranges collapsed to the point where Panther advantages diminished, while Sherman advantages multiplied. And in those conditions, the tank that could fire 20 rounds per minute beat the tank that fired 6. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the pattern was irreversible. German tank production had collapsed under Allied bombing. The Panthers, still in service, were often immobilized by lack of fuel or broken down from lack of spare parts. American Sherman production continued at full pace, with newer variants incorporating improved guns and suspension. The M4A3E8 Sherman, known as the Easy 8, featured the 76mm M1 gun and improved HVSS suspension. While the 76mm gun still couldn't penetrate Panther frontal armor reliably, it could defeat Panther side armor at reasonable ranges, and it maintained the same rapid rate of fire that characterized all Sherman variants. The Easy 8 could still fire approximately 20 rounds per minute from ready ammunition. Against this combination of numbers, firepower, and logistics, German armor was overwhelmed. Individual Panthers continued to achieve impressive kills. Ace tankers still racked up multiple Sherman kills in single engagements, but these tactical victories were meaningless in strategic terms. Germany was losing the war of production, the war of logistics, and ultimately the war itself. The psychological impact on German tankers was profound. They'd been raised on the myth of German technical superiority. Their training emphasized the superiority of German equipment and tactics. The Panther was supposed to be the answer to Soviet 34s. It was supposed to stop the Allied advance. Its specifications promised victory, but specifications didn't account for fighting outnumbered 3-1 while taking 20 hits per minute from tanks that just kept coming. German veterans who survived the war consistently mentioned the psychological strain of fighting Americans. It wasn't the individual skill of American tankers, though many were quite skilled by 1945. It was the relentless pressure, the endless numbers, the continuous fire that never seemed to stop. One captured Panther commander, interrogated in March 1945, stated, "Your tanks are inferior in every way, but you have so many, and they fire so quickly. We cannot fight them all. We destroy 2, 3, 4 of your tanks. But 10 more arrive, and they shoot continuously. We cannot see, we cannot move. Eventually, we are hit. Eventually, we must abandon our tank. It is hopeless." The American response to German technical superiority wasn't to build better tanks. It was to build more adequate tanks and use them more effectively. The Sherman was good enough. Its 75mm gun could handle the majority of German armor it encountered. Panzer Fours, Stooge assault guns, and lighter vehicles comprised most of the German armored force. Against these targets, the Sherman's gun was perfectly adequate. Against Panthers and Tigers, the Sherman relied on numbers, tactics, and sustained fire. This approach horrified efficiency-minded critics. How could you accept trading 2 or 3 Shermans for 1 Panther? How could you justify sending crews into combat in tanks that were outgunned and out-armored? The answer was cold arithmetic. America could replace those losses. Germany couldn't. American crews who bailed out of destroyed Shermans usually survived and returned to combat in new tanks. German crews bailing out of destroyed Panthers often couldn't get replacement tanks. The Sherman's design philosophy, reliability, maintainability, mass production, proved more valuable than the Panther's philosophy of technical excellence. A perfect tank that breaks down is useless. A powerful gun that has no ammunition is useless. Thick armor on a tank that has no fuel is useless. The Sherman worked. It kept working. And there were always more Shermans. Post-war analysis confirmed what battlefield experience had shown. British Operational Research Section No. 2 studied tank casualties in Normandy from June 6 to July 10, 1944. From a sample of 40 Sherman tanks, 33 burned after an average of 1.89 penetrations. From a sample of 22 Panther tanks, 14 burned after an average of 3.24 penetrations. This suggested Panthers were more survivable when hit. But the study also revealed that Panthers were hit more frequently because they were engaged by multiple enemy tanks simultaneously. The sustained fire that American and British tank units could deliver meant Panthers took more hits before being destroyed, but they were being destroyed nonetheless. The study's authors noted that while individual Panther tanks were superior to individual Shermans, Allied tank units were superior to German tank units. The combination of numbers, coordination, and sustained fire outweighed the advantages of better armor and guns. Further studies examined the causes of tank losses. Anti-tank guns accounted for the majority of Allied tank casualties in Normandy. Tank versus tank combat was actually relatively rare. When it occurred, the outcomes favored Germans in individual engagements but favored Allies in aggregate. German tanks achieved better kill ratios per tank, but Allied tanks won the overall tank battles through superior numbers and tactics. The Sherman's rate of fire played a crucial role in this success. While not the only factor, air superiority, artillery support, and infantry coordination all mattered, it was a consistent advantage that American crews could exploit in nearly every engagement. No amount of armor or gunpowder could compensate for being outnumbered and outshot 3-1. The lessons learned from Sherman versus Panther combat influenced post-war tank design. The British Centurion, introduced in 1945, incorporated stabilization for both gun elevation and turret traverse. Soviet designers added stabilization to the T-54. American designers, oddly, initially abandoned stabilization in post-war designs, only reintroducing it with the M60 in the 1970s. But the fundamental principle that tanks must be able to deliver sustained, accurate fire, while maneuvering became foundational to modern armor doctrine. The Sherman served American forces through World War II and beyond. In Korea, M4, A3E8 Shermans fought North Korean 34 tanks and performed adequately. Though technically matched, the Sherman crew's superior training and the tank's mechanical reliability gave American forces an edge. The Sherman finally retired from U.S. service in 1957, replaced by the M48 Patton. But Shermans continued serving with other nations for decades. Israel used modified Shermans through the 1967 Six-Day War. Chile operated Shermans into the 1990s. Paraguay reportedly maintained Shermans for training purposes into the 21st century. The design's fundamental soundness, simple, reliable, maintainable, ensured its longevity far beyond its intended service life. The Panther, for all its technical sophistication, disappeared rapidly after World War II. France operated captured Panthers briefly, but found them too maintenance-intensive. No nation adopted the Panther for post-war service. Its complexity, its fragility, its demanding logistics requirements made it unsuitable for peacetime militaries operating on limited budgets. The Panther existed as a weapon optimized for total war, where national survival justified any expense. In that context, its performance was impressive, but even during the war, its limitations became apparent. The Sherman existed as a weapon optimized for industrial war, where mass production and reliability mattered as much as technical specifications. In that context, the Sherman was nearly perfect. The story of German infantry never expecting Shermans to fire 20 rounds per minute while Panthers reloaded is ultimately a story about assumptions. German military leadership assumed technical superiority would carry them through. They assumed that a better gun and better armor would overcome numerical inferiority. They assumed that training and doctrine would compensate for material disadvantages. These assumptions were wrong. Not completely wrong individual, Panthers frequently outperformed individual Shermans in direct combat, but wrong in aggregate, wrong strategically, wrong in ways that German commanders struggled to accept even as the evidence mounted around them. The Sherman proved that adequate technology, properly applied in overwhelming numbers, beats superior technology deployed insufficiently. It proved that rate of fire matters as much as penetrating power. It proved that logistics and reliability win wars as surely as tactical brilliance. And it proved that sometimes the best tank isn't the one with the thickest armor or the most powerful gun. It's the one that shows up in numbers, works reliably, and fires fast enough to overwhelm the opposition through sheer sustained firepower. For German Panther crews facing American Shermans in France, Belgium, and Germany during 1944 and 1945, these lessons came hard. They climbed into tanks they'd been told were the finest in the world. They'd trained on equipment that represented the pinnacle of German engineering, and they discovered that excellence in isolation is insufficient. That technical superiority, without numerical superiority, leads to defeat. That a perfect shot is useless if you can take only one while your enemy takes 20. The Panther tank stands in history as a remarkable achievement. Its design influenced post-war armor development. Its gun was perhaps the finest anti-tank weapon of its caliber in World War II. Its sloped armor pioneered concepts that became standard. But it lost. It lost to a simpler, more reliable, more numerous opponent that could do one thing the Panther couldn't: fire 20 rounds per minute while the Panther reloaded. That was all that mattered. The Sherman's ability to put sustained fire down range, to suppress enemy positions, to overwhelm defenders, through volume rather than precision. This capability, more than any other, characterized American armored warfare in World War II. It was crude, it was expensive in lives and material, but it worked, and working, reliably, in overwhelming numbers, wins wars. The M4 Sherman served faithfully through some of the most brutal combat of the 20th century. From North Africa to Sicily, from Normandy to the Rhine, from the Philippines to Okinawa, American tankers climbed into their Shermans knowing their tanks weren't perfect, knowing German tanks had better guns and better armor, but knowing also that they could fight effectively, that they could survive, that they could win. The Sherman gave them a fighting chance, not through invulnerability, not through overwhelming individual power, but through reliability, numbers, and the ability to fire faster than the enemy could respond. In the hands of trained crews, working in coordinated units, supported by superior logistics and air power, the Sherman became a war-winning weapon despite its technical shortcomings. General George S. Patton's assessment of the M1 Garand rifle that it was the greatest battle implement ever devised might reasonably be applied to the Sherman tank as well. Not because it was perfect, but because it was good enough, available in sufficient numbers, and able to accomplish its mission despite facing superior opposition. The Sherman didn't win World War II alone. No single weapon system ever does, but it contributed materially to Allied victory, and it did so by being the tank that showed up, that worked, and that fired 20 rounds per minute while Panthers reloaded. For German Panzer crews who faced this reality in combat, the memory never faded. The sound of continuous impacts, the inability to return fire effectively, the knowledge that even if you destroyed 2 or 3 enemy tanks, more were coming, always coming, firing continuously, never stopping. That was the Sherman's gift to Allied victory, not invincibility, not technical perfection. Just reliable, continuous, overwhelming firepower, delivered from tanks that kept showing up no matter how many were destroyed. In the arithmetic of industrial warfare, that proved decisive. The Panther remains a fascinating vehicle to historians and enthusiasts. Its technical specifications are impressive even today. Its influence on post-war tank design is undeniable. But it lost its war. It lost to a simpler opponent that understood something the Germans never fully grasped. That adequate technology in overwhelming quantities, applied relentlessly, beats superior technology deployed insufficiently. The Sherman proved this lesson across thousands of engagements from 1942 through 1945. It proved it again in Korea. Other nations' use of Shermans proved it repeatedly in conflicts through the 1970s. The design worked, it kept working, and its fundamental advantages, simplicity, reliability, and rapid rate of fire remained relevant long after more sophisticated designs had become obsolete. This is the legacy of the Sherman versus Panther matchup, not a story of American tanks being better, a story of American tanks being good enough and numerous enough to overwhelm German technical superiority through industrial might and tactical adaptation. A story of how 20 rounds per minute beats 6 rounds per minute when you're fighting outnumbered but never alone. German infantry never expected this. German tankers never expected this. German commanders planning their defences of France never expected this. They expected technical superiority to matter. They expected their better tanks to win. They learned, through bitter experience, that wars are won not by the best weapons, but by adequate weapons deployed in overwhelming force with competent logistics and sound tactics. The Sherman taught them this lesson, one engagement at a time, one destroyed Panther at a time, 20 rounds per minute at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.